Hello, everyone. I'm Samira Ahmed. I'm an independent journalist. I have no affiliation with Independent Sage, but I've stepped in this week to host the briefing as Alice Roberts can't be here. This has been, I think it's fair to say, a confusing summer of pandemic headlines. Amber Plus lists, a so-called pingdemic, hopes that it could be over, but also fears over an epidemic of long COVID and breakthrough infections. The number of cases dipped dramatically this week, but there's a lot of confusion about why and what it means. So we're delighted to have a guest immunologist this week to answer your questions today. That's Stephen Griffin, who's Associate Professor of Viral Oncology from the University of Leeds. So welcome to you, Stephen. Thanks for being here. But first, Professor Christina Pargel of University College London is going to talk us through this week's numbers. Welcome, Christina. Christina, over to you.
Hi. Right, so let me just share my screen. So yeah, I'm going to go through the numbers today. I was asked to kind of have a look into what's going on, like what does it all mean? So it's a little bit longer than normal. So I might be talking a little quickly just to get through it, because I think there is a lot going on, basically, and lots of things kind of interacting with each other to influence the case numbers that we're seeing. But I'm going to start with vaccinations, then go into cases, then hospitalizations, and then kind of dig into it a bit more. So vaccination data. This is the number of first and second doses given to the 28th of July in the UK. You can see that the numbers have been dropping quite a lot, and we're really now mostly doing second doses, and that's kind of picking up these people who got first doses 8 or so weeks ago. So yes, far fewer people are getting their first dose now, but we have come a long way. So we've only got about 6 million adults left without any dose, and we've got 9 million who have had one dose and are waiting for their second. So it'll probably be at around the rate we're doing second doses, another 6 to 8 weeks to finish the second doses. And then the question is, how many of those 6 million that haven't yet taken up the vaccine can we encourage to get vaccinated over the coming months? Overall, as I said, we're still making progress. There's still about a third of people who aren't fully vaccinated, and that is, we have 20% of our population of children who aren't eligible for a vaccine at the moment. So that is kind of the issue. So what we're really doing at the moment is turning these blue people into orange people. Wales is doing really, really well, with almost 65% of its overall population fully vaccinated. Just looking at it by age, this is for England only, so the 25th of July, you can see really high coverage in the over 50s. We're starting to see actually a drop off in second dose coverage in the 40-year-olds, 40 plus, who are eligible and have been eligible for several months. So we really want to see this approaching the blue mark. 2/3 of 18 to 24-year-olds have had a first dose, and I think that is quite encouraging. Obviously, we want to get up to over 80%. So how we do that is a real question. This is just looking at it by gender. Yellow is female and blue is male, and you can see that although things are pretty even in the higher age groups, in the younger age groups, women are coming forward more than men to take up vaccination. And we still have this persistent difference by ethnicity. So this is now second dose coverage, so full dose coverage for over 50s by ethnicity. And we're still seeing quite a marked difference between white populations and non-white, particularly Black British. So, I mean, that's just been consistent for the last 4 or 5 months, and we haven't really been able to do that much to change this. And I think that is still a concern. So, cases. This is new UK confirmed cases by reported date. So people who've had a positive test by the day it was reported. And you can see here, really starting on the 19th of July, you start having these very steep falls. And then just in the last couple of days, we've seen it going up again to over 30,000, which is clearer here if we just zoom into the last month or two. If we look at it by nation, it is quite different. So Scotland, this is number of cases per 100,000 people per week, so we can compare the different nations. Scotland really started going down beginning of July, and that's been very consistent since then. In England, you saw basically a kind of a peak here on the 19th of July, and then it's been coming down. Northern Ireland had a very, very steep increase and is flat, and Wales is going up and then coming down really gradually, and it's not quite clear where that's going either. If we're looking at positivity rates, so the proportion of people who've had a positive test, which takes into account whether people have changed their testing behaviour to some extent, you can see similar patterns there. So Scotland has been declining since beginning of July, England's more recently, and Wales is kind of flat, and Northern Ireland got really high and is now starting to come down, but still, you know, over 15% positivity rate is really high and just shows that we're not testing enough. And in fact, none of the nations have got to 5%, and you really want your positivity rate to be below 5% if you're testing enough people. Looking at English regions, this isn't to the 4th of July, it's to 24th of July. You can see they've all come down, all pretty much at exactly the same time. The northeast was the highest and it's fallen the furthest. And we still have the highest case rates in the north, northeast Yorkshire and the northwest. And just looking at local authority, English local authorities, this is positivity rates. And orange is this week and grey is the week before. You can see almost every single local authority has got a lower positivity rate this week than last week. So that is good news, but they're still quite high, and there's still, you know, a number that are over 15%, which is really, really high positivity rates. And we're a long way from where we were last September, which is these green dots. So this is just England. So, you know, I said the last 2 days we've seen an increase that's driven by England, which you can see here. Now, this is by date of test. So this is only 2 days ago, and we know that this number is going to go up today as they add more results that come through the labs. And we see this same pattern in every English region. So where we saw a fall in every region, we're now seeing an increase in every region. So that's kind of implying that something systematic is happening across England. And before we get too cheery about declines, the Office of National Statistics Infection Survey today that came out says that prevalence in England, Wales and Northern Ireland is still going up to the 24th of July. So after we saw case reductions in the official figures, and only Scotland is seeing decreases. And I'm going to come back to this later. So hospitalizations and deaths. This is the number of people in hospital per million people in the UK nations. Scotland is the only nation that's really declining and has been since mid-July, kind of following a couple of weeks after its cases started dropping. But everywhere else, hospital occupancy is still going up. We can see here more clearly about how Scottish hospitals, so cases started falling beginning of July around here, and about 7 to 10 days later, you start seeing hospital admissions falling. And that gives us a lot more confidence that actually the drop in cases in Scotland is real. And if you think about Scotland, what happened was at the end of June, schools finished. So their school holiday started earlier than in England. And also their football, the European Football Championship ended a few weeks before England as well. And they haven't gone to final opening. They haven't opened up to the extent that England has yet. Admissions to English hospitals are flat over the last few days. So they're at about 800 a day. So are they going to drop? That's the question. Are we now going to see a drop, or are they going to flatten off and then go up again? And even though, you know, we are seeing a few hospital admissions, there are still serious admissions, and we are now seeing patients who need intensive care treatment. It is going up. I mean, we're nowhere near where we were in January, but we are still getting people getting very sick with COVID. And this is just showing hospital admissions by region. And the only reason I'm showing this is really to show you that it looks like the national flattening off is mainly because of the Northwest, where things are dropping, and the Midlands, where they're stabilising. So in London, for instance, and the Southwest, hospital admissions are still going up. So we are seeing a more varied picture there by region. And it matters, not just because going to hospital is not a good outcome, but this is from a report released today by the Nuffield Trust. And they're saying that when you have high COVID and high demand, you have problems because they have more staff absences related to COVID. So they doubled in June this year in hospitals from 6,000 to 13,000. And that's people off sick, but also people who have to self-isolate or have family that's self-isolating that they need to look after. And having high COVID cases also reduces capacity because you need to separate COVID wards from non-COVID wards, and you need to use more intensive PPE, which takes longer to put on and take off, and it just makes everything more difficult. So actually there is a burden to having a lot of people in hospital with COVID, even if it's not the same number that we had back in January. And finally, on hospitals, there's this kind of idea that somehow people in hospital with COVID aren't there because of COVID, but they're for other reasons that just happen to be testing positive. That is not true. New data released by NHS England yesterday shows that 80% of patients who test positive for COVID in hospital are in hospital because of COVID, because they're sick with COVID. And that has stayed very flat for the last month. So, why haven't vaccines broken the link to hospitalizations when they do work very well? Well, this is a really nice chart from the Financial Times. And basically what they're showing is that what the vaccines do is effectively reduce your risk by about 30 years of age. So someone who's 80 has their risks reduced to that of a 50-year-old. So it's massively lower than it would have been without the vaccine, but it's not zero, right? There's still a more risk than me, even if I hadn't had the vaccine, for instance. And so that's why you're still seeing people in hospital. The vaccines are really good, but they can't take away all risk. But we are in a much better position than we would be without them. So this is another plot from the Financial Times showing the grey is where we are with hospital admissions. And if we didn't have the vaccines, we would be already beyond the January peak now. So that's what vaccines have done for us. They're making a massive difference. But again, it doesn't mean that you will never see hospital admissions. And just looking at number of deaths, you see exactly the same kind of thing with vaccine impact, in that deaths are going up in the UK, but we're much, 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 much lower levels than we are in January. And that is the vaccines working for us. So why the reduction in cases? Well, there are many factors. One of the big ones, I think, actually is schools. The latest data from Department for Education that came out this week, which goes up to the 15th of July, shows that in the last week, over 1 million pupils were absent from primary and secondary school. That's 15%. And that is going to start having an impact on transmission in schools. And regionally, you can see here that in that last week, the percentage of children who are absent in the most hard-hit regions, like the Northeast, Yorkshire, and the Midlands, was well over a quarter of children were off school because of COVID. So yes, not only is that really bad for disruption to education, but it is going to be breaking the link between a lot of transmission, and that will be having an impact on slowing growth in these age groups. And we can see also, just in terms of confirmed cases, of the different school-age children. So this is 0 to 4 and 5 to 9-year-olds. So that's primary school children or nursery school children who aren't routinely tested. So their cases are coming down since the school holidays, but not nearly as much as for the 10 to 19-year-olds. And that's going to be a combination of that impact of a lot of them being off school already, but also once they're off school for the holidays, you're not doing lateral flow tests anymore. So they're not testing as much. So that's kind of this dual impact of they're isolating, but they're also doing fewer tests. And that's going to bring the reported cases for this age group down quite a lot. Football. So we already have seen Public Health Scotland said they had a lot of cases related to football in Scotland. We see the same thing. So this, lots of different ways of looking at it. And what this chart shows you is the difference between the positivity rates, the proportion of people testing positive between women and men. And basically, any line that's above the black line here, above 0, is that women have a higher positivity rate than men. And any line below is men have a higher positivity rate than women. And what you can see that apart from children, men have a high rate throughout the pandemic. And that's because women get tested a lot more than men. And over the last month, what you can see is that the highest difference by far is in men who are 20 to 29, have 10% higher positivity rate than women. And then the next highest group is men aged 30 to 39. So you can see here that during the last month, men were having much, much higher positivity rates than women, and were still getting tested less. If we look at the same kind of chart, but this time with cases per 100,000 per week, again, if you're above the line, women have more cases, and if you're below the line, men have more cases. So for the whole of the pandemic up to June, women in all age groups had more cases, and that's because they're getting tested more, basically. And where it has least impact is the 0 to 19-year-olds, because they're children, and then the children don't really choose to get tested, their parents choose to get them tested. But here in June, for the first time in the pandemic, cases in men of 20 to 29 overtake that of women, and by a long way. And you see the same thing with the 30 to 39-year-olds, and that's despite having fewer tests. So I think what we're seeing is that there was a massive spike associated probably with the football, and actually even then we didn't get nearly as many cases as we should have done. There were many more cases than were reported in that age group. And just kind of looking at it more broadly, just in terms of age groups for all sexes, you can see that the biggest drops over the last week have been in the 20 to 59-year-old group. I think that's partly explains why we're not seeing hospitalizations for yet. So the blue line is cases in England, and the red line is hospital admissions in England, set back by week to kind of correspond to when those people would have got sick a week earlier. And it tracks pretty well. And just here, you should be starting to see it fall. And we're just not quite there yet. But I think also because a lot of people in hospital are actually in this age group, and that fall's been much less, we might not see that kind of impact over the next week. So we'll kind of have to keep an eye on that. Then there's behavior. This is from the Ons Lifestyle Survey, and a majority of people of all ages were worried about lifting the rules, particularly people over 30. So, about 60% of people over 30 were either worried or very worried about the opening. And when they were asked, what are you going to keep doing after the 19th of July, almost everybody said they're going to keep washing hands, they're going to keep self-isolating if they have symptoms, they're going to keep wearing a mask in shops and on public transport, and avoid crowded places and maintain some social distancing. I mean, in all cases, 16 to 29-year-olds are least likely to say yes. But a significant portion of people are going to keep doing, so they're going to keep doing this stuff. And even though it's smaller, we're still seeing people saying they're going to try and open windows, they're going to avoid travel, going to try and meet up outdoors and work from home. What people aren't really wanting to do is do lateral flow tests regularly. And then if you actually look at socializing, the number of people who said they'd met up with people indoors or outdoors, this is the 19th of July. And yes, it went up, but it hasn't leapt up, right? There's not a massive change. So actually, I do think part of it is that people haven't changed their behavior as much as you might have thought after 19th of July. And then finally, in the behaviour section, ONS released today saying that in the past 7 days, 6% of adults said they had self-isolated. And this is, directly a consequence of high infections and the so-called pingdemic. But it is having an impact. If you take 6% of the population out of circulation, you will slow growth. I mean, it's certainly not enough to explain it on its own, but it is another factor for slowing growth in cases. And then getting tested. We're seeing fewer tests over the last week, particularly in the rapid lateral flow tests. So a lot of that is schools being shut, but also it could be that people are just not doing them anymore. And we're also seeing a reduction in PCR tests. So what the kind of tests you should be having if you get symptoms. Now, some of that will be due to there being less COVID, if there is less COVID. But some of it might also be due to more reluctance to get tested. There's been a lot of coverage of the pingdemic, a lot of coverage of everything being open. So it could be that people want to go on holiday or they want to go and see their friends, that actually there's a lot of incentive not to test positive. And so people who have, say, mild symptoms or quite ambiguous symptoms like hay fever or cold are unwilling to come forward to get tested. Now, we can't really tease that part, but it might be a factor. And one kind of corroboration for that is the King's College London Zoe Symptom Tracker app, where people log their symptoms, has not shown this decrease that the government figures have shown. And generally, even though the numbers are different between the app and cases, normally they do have the same trend. But of course, putting your symptoms in the app doesn't come with any requirement to isolate or give your contacts up. So it is slowing down and it is flat, but it's not showing this. So it could be that you have all these factors that are slowing growth and have made it maybe plateau or maybe even drop slightly, but not as much as you might suggest from the reported figures. And that's where we come to the Ons survey, which is kind of telling you something similar. Now, this is measuring not new cases, but how many people test positive right now, which is slightly different. And we know that you can test positive on a PCR test for quite a few weeks after your initial infection. And so some of the people who are being picked up here might actually have got infected a few weeks ago. So when you're when you're at a peak and on a downward trend, the prevalence infection survey can take a little bit longer to show that. So in Scotland, it's taken about 2 weeks to show the reduction that you saw in cases. So I don't think this means everything is wrong and everything's going really badly, but I think it is showing, there has been a drop, but it probably isn't as big as it looks from the cases. And if you go into the age profile, I think it becomes even clearer, because here you see there is kind of a flattening or a drop in people between about 18 and 49, but increases in school-aged children. So what could be happening is that we're not picking up cases in school-aged children in the official figures, either because children don't have symptoms or they don't have kind of the classic symptoms that would make people think they should get tested, or actually it's quite hard to test kids. And even if they do a test, it's coming out negative. So I think this is kind of giving us a clue that actually what's happening is that we're under ascertaining cases here, and these have slowed but haven't dropped off quite as precipitously as we might think. And finally, people have talked about herd immunity. Have we reached herd immunity? I don't think we have, partly because we're just not there yet. With Delta, we probably need at least 85% of your population immune, and we're just not there. We're at somewhere between 55 and 65% fully vaccinated, plus maybe another 15% people who've had COVID, 20% maybe, but that's not getting you to 85%. And if it was herd immunity, if it was something where we'd reached this threshold where suddenly that on its own could damp things down, what you would see is a more gradual stop as more people get immune, and then gradually R goes through one, and then a more gradual drop. You wouldn't see a massive spike and then a massive drop off. And you wouldn't expect to see it in all places at the same time, because different places have different levels of immunity. So this kind of idea that it's all happening at once makes you think actually it probably isn't that. And we're still seeing in places like Israel that cases are still going up there, even though Israel is quite a lot more vaccinated than we are. So again, that's another reason to think, well, actually, if 55, 56% was enough, then Israel wouldn't be seeing this. So just to summarize, cases are coming down or flat in all nations. They've dropped a lot in England since 19th of July, but the last few days are showing an increase again. Hospitalizations are coming down in Scotland and Northern Ireland, actually, but they're flat in Wales and England. And ONS reports that prevalence is still increasing everywhere except Scotland. So this is my take, right? So my take is you've had significant school disruption, particularly in the north, and that is slowing growth in children and their families and contacts. I think the pingdemic is actually having an impact in slowing growth in adults. The football is over, and so that is stopping further growth associated with those kinds of gatherings. I think many people are still being cautious, so not massive change in behaviour from pre-19th of July to after. And I also think there might be some reluctance to get tested if you're symptomatic, or trying to be more cautious because you don't want to get pinged before you're on holiday. But But I do think, that clubs being open, that we've got mass events like Latitude Festival, that holiday travel are all likely to contribute to more growth. And I think we're starting to see that now. So I do think that there was kind of a genuine drop due to a combination of factors, but I don't think it was as large as it seems from the numbers. And I also think, unfortunately, it's probably short-lived. The fact that we're in school holidays now will help a lot to keep cases down, but I do think that will be offset by reduced requirements to isolate. So, for instance, a lot of key workers now don't have to isolate anymore. And also, I think for mid-August, they're changing the rules around isolation. Plus, everything is open, including large events. And I think as cases, as we've seen coverage of cases coming down, I also think that changes people's behaviour, and people might now become less cautious as they're thinking it's kind of okay. So that's kind of where I think we are. I think there has been a slowing down, but it will probably speed up again now. And I will end there.
Christina, that was brilliant. Thank you. And I know that because we do have Stephen Griffin, our guest immunologist, Dean Pillay, you've got a question for him to kind of open up into starting to take questions.
Thanks, and add my thanks to Christina's great summary. So thank you, Steve, for joining us. Unfortunately, Sarah Rowland-Jones was unable to join us advertised, but for a last minute had to pull out. But Steve, I'm sure there will be questions around variants and so forth, and what your thoughts are about future evolution of the virus. But something that's not really been discussed very much has been treatments for COVID-19. Clearly, there have been a number of therapies made available in hospitalized patients. The recovery trial and other trials have identified a number of interventions that have slowed the progression to death, luckily. But nevertheless, as Christina said, we're still getting hospitalizations, and there's still a large number of infections. Where are we with the development of much safer, easier to use antiviral drugs of the form that we, for instance, have against influenza, things that could be used in the community that could also reduce infectivity of those who are infected, but also reduce the risk of people having to go to hospital and maybe getting into intensive care?
That's right, Dean. And of course, these could be tremendously important, as you say, across the globe, really. I think it's fair to say that the majority of effort that we've seen through the pandemic has been attempts to what we call repurpose drugs that we've used to treat other viruses, for example. And the main problem with that was that there really wasn't that much on the shelf for us to pick up and take on. And people are probably aware of drugs like remdesivir, which we had high hopes for, didn't seem to be that impressive clinically, although there are probably issues with when you have to treat with these drugs as well to make them the most effective. But I think it's fair to say that because the majority of the effort was in repurposing, that hasn't perhaps been as successful as we would have hoped. But there are some promising candidates coming through. So, for example, Pfizer have some new inhibitors of the protease, which is one of the enzymes that the virus uses to literally chop up its proteins into their functional components. That seems to be very promising. That's in trials now. I think there are actually 2 drugs in those regimens. And there is also another drug that targets the viral enzyme, the polymerase, that replicates the viral genome, something called molnupiravir. That's kind of related to remdesivir, similar kind of drug. So these things are on the way. But I think it's fair to say that the sorts of investment that we saw in vaccines and in repurposing drugs hasn't necessarily been put into the effort in making new ones. And I think that's a bit of a shame, because I think we do have the capacity to do that. I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but it certainly hasn't happened on the scale that we saw for those other avenues of exploration.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I know that you'll come in on the questions that we're going to start taking from the public as well. Just one thing I wanted to bring up, and I think Stephen Reicher, you're the person to answer it. I've really noticed the NHS has started out with a new load of public information campaigns, a big emphasis on getting vaccinated, but also trying to remind people to be cautious and maintain all the things that are now no longer compulsory, but were. What do you make of the messaging and how far it will help the situation?
Well, I think the most fundamental thing about the messaging is that there is a real danger that what's coming through from the UK government in particular is a message that infections don't matter. So first of all, in terms of what's been said, Sajid Javid, for instance, talking about 100,000 cases, but not seeing that as a cause for action. And secondly, just looking at the various policies seems to indicate that if infections go up, it's not cause for changing policy. And I think one of the most important points to get over is infections do matter, and therefore it makes sense to act to stop infections, because once you start to indicate to people that infections don't matter, you can't expect people to undertake the mitigations necessary to stop infection, whether that's being cautious in your behavior or even getting vaccinated. And there is some evidence, admittedly anecdotal, we need more systematic evidence, but some evidence that some young people are not getting vaccinated because they don't think they need to, because it doesn't matter if they get infected. So I think one of the clearest messages we need to give is, yes, infections do matter. They matter partly because a lot of people aren't vaccinated yet, as Christina's pointed out, partly because some people who are vaccinated will get infected, partly because of long COVID and the consequences of long COVID, partly because of the disruption. So I do think that's critical. The second point I would want to make, however, and again, this comes over very clearly from the data that Christina showed us and has been shown throughout the pandemic, is that by and large, actually the public have been listening to the science. They are aware that the pandemic is still there and they are still being cautious. If, for instance, the number of contacts we had went up to the levels it was at before the pandemic, if we've acted as if the pandemic was over, it could almost triple the rate of infection, and all the models show it's absolutely critical, but people aren't increasing those contacts. That's really important to understand. So the public are actually showing responsibility. They are doing what the government has said they should do. They always have been. The real problem is, however, that for people to act responsibly, they need support from the government. So it's all very well saying things like ventilate, but how can you ventilate if public spaces aren't well ventilated, if we don't have clear standards, if they're not publicized, if they're not monitored and so on? It's all very well saying to people, please self-isolate if you get infected. And of course, that's one of the most basic things we need to do. But again, that's difficult to do unless there's the support. So I go back to the point that the problem throughout this pandemic has not been a government let down by a public who have ignored the dangers and over-socialized. It's actually been, on the whole, a public who understand what they need to do, but they haven't been given the necessary support and they haven't been given the necessary information they need by the government. And that's what needs to change.
Stephen, thank you. Right, we've got a question from Alexandra Thompson from Yahoo. If you want to turn on your camera and mic. Hello.
Hi there, good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to talk about Professor Neil Ferguson's comment earlier this week that the bulk of the pandemic will be behind us by October. It's been met by a lot of criticism, and in my much lower station as a journalist, I was quite surprised that such a prominent modeller was saying this. So I'd be interested to hear just your general opinion on that, but also, because it was so widely reported, how the public may interpret it if you're concerned about complacency, because October in the grand scheme of things is not far away.
Thank you. Yeah, it did get quite a lot of attention. Who wants to take that first? Christina.
So I saw it get a lot of attention and a lot of criticism. I have to say that I'm not that critical of it, because by October, if the bulk isn't behind us, it implies the bulk's ahead of us, which would be pretty terrible, right? It's not inconsistent with having really high infections this summer either. We can have really high infections and have the bulk behind us by October. So I actually think, if we haven't got the bulk behind us by October, we've done something really, really badly wrong. And our future strategy will be really badly wrong. We know how to keep cases down now. We know how to do it. The fact that we haven't done it is one thing. But, if we really are in a situation where the worst is ahead of us in October, then we should all hang our heads in shame, basically. That's how I see it.
That's really helpfully explained, Christina. Thank you. Anthony.
Yeah, I agree with Christina. To me, the big question is what happens beyond October. And I'd like to put a question almost back to Steve Griffin. I mean, a lot of virologists rightly are saying, look, when you get pandemics, completely novel virus, you know, it can cause mayhem across the world. But then gradually the exposure to infection, and now we've got the booster of a vaccine that seems to work, although it's imperfect, will mean that, you know, the population has now got levels of immunity. Things will die down. We've seen deaths and hospitalizations come down. But this is an odd virus, and it does do some peculiar things, and we still don't understand it all. So my question to Steve is, and I know there's always difficulty in relating lab stuff to what actually happens, but there's talk about the virus making T cells dysfunctional, you know, the cellular bit of immunity. And do you see an endemic state that is largely flat after we've got this under control? Or do you think we're going to see still a lot of problems like long COVID, perhaps little surges that wax and wane, and that it may be a more unpleasant state of endemicity than perhaps after an influenza pandemic?
Thank you, Steve.
That's a really, really good question, Anthony. Thank you. I think a lot of it depends on what policy dictates the eventual outcome of the vaccination policy is going to be. Because I think people talk about herd immunity, and we've heard Christina's very good reasoning for why we're really not there yet. Part of that reason is because we know that the vaccine response is so much better than the response we make to natural infection. The virus is very good at playing tricks on our immune system. It does lessen, as you say, Anthony, the T cell responses. It can also inhibit the setting down of what we call the immune memory, which means in the long term, you're more likely in the long term, if you haven't had a vaccine, to be infected again. And of course, if we continue to see lots and lots of cases and give that virus the capacity to change, because the virus can't change if it's not infecting people and amplifying itself and replicating, and we also change its environment to have at least, you know, if it's a suboptimal, i.e. a partial level of vaccination in the country, then you are essentially creating a mixing vessel in which new forms of the virus could eventually happen and keep coming back. And we know this happens for influenza, but primarily driven by changes in the virus that make it better at infecting us, really. With SARS coronavirus 2, we're not in the endemic phase yet. We're still seeing exponential growth. We still see huge capacity of this virus. If you think about the number of viruses across the planet, the capacity for this virus to change is very large indeed. So I think until we decide whether we want to try and achieve maximum vaccine coverage with our vaccines to try and protect people through a population-based immunity approach, or if we're just going to try and protect those that we deem most vulnerable, which is not an easy task, I think it's going to be very hard to say what the eventual endemicity level will be like. And I think it's important to point out that when we achieve that, it's because we are changing. We're affecting our immune status as a population. The virus doesn't really change. If you then put that virus back into a naive population, you're going to get the same sorts of diseases that we're seeing now. So it really does depend on what the strategy is with the vaccines, I believe. I personally would try and cover as many people as we possibly can, because these vaccines are incredibly effective. And what we really don't want to do is undermine their usefulness by allowing this virus to catch up with us in this race.
Brilliant, Gabriel. Then I'd like to move on to more questions. So just in the time we have, Gabriel, go ahead.
Alexandra, your question was a great one. And I personally, I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know about the quality of any of the modelers' crystal balls, but I tell you this for nothing, and that is that we can't rely on them. We must not rely on a modeling prediction and change what we need to do on the basis of modeling prediction, because it's a gamble. We've had the serious new variants which have changed the picture really dramatically for us, and we're on to our third, I suppose, serious version of the virus in this country alone. And I can't see any reason why there wouldn't be a fourth or a fifth or a sixth, and why it isn't possible for those to be extraordinarily dangerous and undermine what we've done. So if there is an advantage coming in terms of reduced cases, well, for goodness sake, let's use any slack water we have to get all the preventive stuff in place that we didn't have in place and that left us so vulnerable, not having good local public health teams that could, for example, take on the really difficult task of completing a vaccination program. Having been involved in vaccination programs over my 40 years in public health, I know it's easy to get it up to 70 or 80%. Getting it up to 90% and above is really tough work. And there's no one around to do that really tough on the ground work at the moment. The NHS is up to its armpits in trying to deal with the work that has been delayed. So we need to do that. We need to understand that this is an airborne disease. And just as if it was, coming through our water supplies, we would take action about our water supplies to ensure that they were providing us with clean water. And we should be taking action with regard to our air supplies in enclosed spaces to ensure that they're fit for purpose as well, and we're getting clean, fresh air into workplaces in particular, which is what the law says. So I would love us not to be distracted by the modelling and deal with what we've got to do to keep us safe over the next, not just a couple of months, but over the rest of this year and into next year as well.
Gabriel, thank you. I've got a question from Graham Lawton from New Scientist. Hello, Graham.
Hi, yeah, thanks for this. Stephen, you mentioned ventilation, and I think we're going to realise how important ventilation is in indoor spaces, but it's very hard to tell whether a space is well ventilated or not. Is there any advice that you could give to people about how they could tell for themselves when they enter a classroom or a supermarket or whatever, whether there's decent ventilation? And Gabriel, I know you're also very interested in this. What's happening with ventilation? You particularly have been going on about it for ages. As we're in school holidays now, it would seem to be an opportunity for schools to ventilate their classrooms more thoroughly. Is anything actually happening with that?
Graham, I know of nothing happening. I really don't know of anything happening. I think it's an absolute and utter disgrace. And it just, I'm always lost for words. It's so simple. The law states, it's in the Health and Safety of Work regulation. The law states that people working in enclosed spaces have to be provided with adequate, fresh or purified air. And COVID has changed the definition, and we need to come up with definitions of what constitutes, as you say, how do you know? We need good definitions that people can check. The second point about it is, we don't know whose job it will be to go and check that. And we need a regulatory system put in place. And we're good at doing that sort of stuff in this country. So let's get on and do it. And just like restaurants have to be regularly inspected for their level of food hygiene, workplaces should be inspected for their level of ventilation. But also people need the knowledge. And I'm deeply impressed by some of the stuff in the States. And I mention very often the New York school system. And you can, if you have a child in a school in New York, you can go on the bit of the website for your child's school, and every room in that school is numbered. And for every room, there will be a ventilation report as to the adequacy of the ventilation. And we are not tackling this at all. And I think it's deeply concerning and a really serious failure, because we're going to need good ventilation for years to come, and it will pay dividends in all sorts of other respiratory diseases as well.
Thank you, Gabriel. Stephen.
Yeah, so a couple of points. I mean, first of all, I'm sure we all see the adverts that very frequently come up on television about WaterAid and how dirty water kills people throughout the world. And they are heartbreaking to see how in other countries, children have to drink dirty water that carries so many infections and causes so much mortality. And I think we've got to become as aware of the dangers of dirty air as of dirty water. We would not tolerate dirty water coming into our schools. We wouldn't tolerate our children having to drink water which infects them, but we seem to tolerate dirty air. And we've got to change that fundamentally. There's got to be a fundamental change in attitude. And as Gabriel says, we're not doing it in this country, but things are being done in other countries. So in New York, not only can you find out levels of ventilation in every classroom. They are now aiming to put 2 air purifiers in every classroom to do something about it. If you go to Belgium, they are planning to put in CO2 monitors, which allows you to assess how well ventilated a space is in all public spaces. So yes, it's being done, and yes, it's got to be done, but it's not being done here, and that's shameful.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to public questions, and we have people who are here to ask questions. So Lisa Mayer, first of all, is going to ask a question on behalf of her sister Cassie. Hello, Lisa.
Hiya. Yeah, this is Cassie's question. A recent blood test for the ONS study came back negative for COVID antibodies. I had the AstraZeneca vaccine in February with the second in April, 9.5 weeks later. My GP took another set of bloods last week and the lab sent them back with the result not protected. She's unsure what to do, but says I'm unlikely to get either another vaccine or the booster, although I turn 65 in September. Should I assume I have no immune response to COVID-19? And if yes, how can I protect myself without remaining on permanent lockdown?
Thank you so much. Sorry, it's a distressing situation. Steve.
Yeah, I'm very, very sorry to hear that. Of course, that's a really sad state of affairs, because everyone's hoping that these vaccines are going to give us the way forward. Now, the problem is that we are genetically diverse as a species, and actually the way that our immune systems become programmed by vaccines, or indeed following an infection, does also differ. And there are sadly some people that just do not, for whatever reason, make the ideal response to even something as potent as these coronavirus vaccines that we're using. So whilst your sister, you say she does have detectable antibodies, but they're not necessarily protective. So that does show that she is making a response.
No antibodies.
No antibodies in the first one. And then, yeah. But the chances are that she would have also made a response in her cell-mediated immune response, which are your T cells, which would find cells that are infected by the virus and kill them. So that's the job of T cells. So you would hope that there was still protection from a severe course of COVID. However, I think that you would be absolutely justified in talking to your doctor and talking to people at hospitals and asking for a booster for this reason. I think this is exactly the sort of thing that we need to be looking at if we do start to roll out booster programs. We do have antibody tests available. We do know that we can discriminate between people that have just had natural infection or just had vaccines. And so we need to be a bit more careful about this if we are going to use a booster type strategy with our vaccines. And I would say that your sister is an absolute prime candidate to receive a booster. And if the AZ didn't work for her, then perhaps a different form of vaccine may do. But again, we should be able to tolerate multiple doses of these vaccines going forward if that's the path that we choose to do. The other option, of course, is to achieve higher vaccination coverage, drive down cases, because then fewer cases means less risk. So we need to do both, in my view. But it is unfortunately just a fact of our genetics that not everybody makes the ideal response, I'm afraid.
That's so helpful, Steve. Maybe, Lisa, you could quote Steve Griffin for Cassie's GP.
She needs to be more careful when she's with my parents, who are 87 and 92.
Sorry, say that again. I didn't hear the beginning.
She needs to take more care if she's seeing my parents, who are in their late 80s and 90s.
Well, if they've had their vaccine, then hopefully they won't necessarily pose as much of a risk to her. But, you know, there are some simple things you can do, as we've just been talking about: ventilation, wear a mask, keep your distance inside. All these MPIs, the non-pharmacological interventions that we have used up until the availability of the vaccines, are tremendously effective. And you saw the effect of people's behavior from Christina's presentation. You know, we can stop this transmission. The vaccines give us the way forward in the longer term, but we know we can control this virus. So in the interim period before you get a booster, hopefully, then just take those precautions. And I think actually another aspect of what we're seeing with allowing infections to run riot is that people who have spent most of 2020 doing what we call shielding loosely, have been pretty much condemned to doing that again. And I guess your sister's probably feeling amongst that group. And I think that is one of the worst aspects of the current government strategy myself. I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's right, especially as this is a vaccine preventable disease and also something that we know we can control.
Thank you. Anthony, briefly, and then I was going to take more questions.
Briefly, Lisa, I think I'm in the same age group as your sister, and I think I had the vaccine at exactly the same time, and a month ago I got COVID. So, you know, you get breakthrough infections, and you know, I was quite unwell for 3 weeks, but I didn't end up in hospital and I didn't die. So, I mean, clearly there's some protection that I must have had from the vaccine. But thank you for raising that, because it does make you wonder whether, if you're in that group, you know, I'll have to think about, I'll be keen to get a booster, and maybe, as Steve suggests, perhaps go for another vaccine. It's a very important question.
I'm going to try and get in some more questions, and I'm going to go for some quite short ones. Dan, Oregon, you've got a question if you want to turn on your camera and mic.
Hi, quick question about variants. I think, you know, we were all taken very much by surprise last autumn with the emergence of the Kent variant. I'm just wondering, what is the likelihood, or how likely is it that we will see something very similar happening with the Delta variant this time round?
Thank you so much. I think a lot of people are wondering about variants. Steve, we're getting our money's worth from you.
Well, the virologist,
Christina.
Well, Dan, the answer is that while we have high levels of circulation across the planet, the virus is trying to do two things. It's trying to get better at infecting us. Remember, it only jumped from an animal species, probably bats, just over a year ago, year and a half. So it's still getting better at infecting people. So we've seen changes in the virus that do that. The Kent variant, Alpha variant, was an example of that. It got much more transmissible, much more infectious. We also have the element that the virus will try to maintain its transmission. It's the ultimate selfish gene. It just wants to transmit and amplify. And one of the barriers to that process is our immune system, our immune response. And so for that reason, it's also changing its genetics to evade at least our antibody immunity in part. We're taking steps down that road. That's not to say we're going to lose all the protection from our vaccines necessarily, but even another step down that road could cause us problems, as we are seeing with Delta and Beta and others. So really, the answer to your question is yes, whilst we still have high levels of circulation, particularly if we're pushing the virus by having vaccination that doesn't overtake the virus replication in a country, yes, we will probably drive the creation of more variants, but it takes time. And we also have lots of mutations in variants that we don't understand in terms of what they're doing for the virus, which we need to really understand well. We're focused on spike at the moment because that's our vaccine candidate. It's the thing that gets the virus into our cells, but there are changes elsewhere which probably do affect the outcomes as well. So I'm afraid there will be more until such time as we have control of this virus, at least in the UK and elsewhere.
Christina, were you going to come in on that as well? And I was just thinking as well in the background, you know, the changes to countries being taken off quarantine lists, and the fact that much of the developing world is still not getting access to vaccines. It's presumably all part of the concern about variants, isn't it? Sorry, that was a question. Sort of.
I mean, all I would say is that at the moment we're seeing rising infections in most high-income, highly vaccinated countries. And if we see a new variant pop up in any of them, it will spread to all of them because there's a lot of travel going on this summer. So that is a problem, I think, for me. And I mean, I'm not going to add to Steve's analysis on the likelihood of a new variant. I would just say that at every stage, COVID's had nasty surprises up its sleeve, and I don't see why it would stop now.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
Yeah. Sorry, Steve, go ahead, and then I'll take another question.
So just very briefly, I think it is important to understand, you know, how variants originate, and it's not something that just happens quickly overnight. Okay, so this virus isn't as variable as a virus such as HIV or hepatitis C, but it does change. But there are two stages to a mutation becoming entrenched in a viral population in order for it to persist and become dominant. One is this sort of random process where the virus is continuously trying different versions of itself. That may be successful, it may not be. And then it also has to be sort of locked in. And for it to be locked in, it needs to be in an environment that's favorable for that to happen. So it really has to be an improvement in that virus's capabilities. And you see in variants that it's not just one change, it's multiple changes that happen over time. So the longer we leave these infections to last, the more likely it is to happen. And, you know, evolution doesn't just go at a constant rate. It can have jumps and it can slow down. So, you know, really the best thing to do is to remove infections from your population.
Okay, thank you. I want to get another 2 questions if I can. Marion Dawson, I think you're in Greater Manchester, and thank you for waiting. You just want to unmute, sorry.
Hi, sorry about that. Yeah, I'm confused about how cautious I should be with the current infection and death rates. I live in Greater Manchester, which has had high levels all through the pandemic. I live with my parents, who are both over 70 and now behaving as normal, although they do wear FFP2 masks in shops. And my brother, who is the same, but wears a scarf. We were all double jabbed, apart from my brother, who was about to have a second. Should I be using public transport or going to indoor events? Should I go back to my job supporting students in September, which involves sitting in lecture theatres full of people? I want to do the right thing, more for others than for myself.
Thank you, Marion. It's a question I think is speaking on behalf of many people who feel really confused. Who wants to start on this one? Dinan.
Thanks, Marion. I agree. These are many people are considering all of these things and risks, and they're also linked to people that they're close to, and therefore are themselves vulnerable, as well as potentially sources of infection. It's great that, you know, your close family are immunized. It does really reduce not only their risk of infection, but also their risk of actually, if they were infected, of being, you know, highly infectious to others. But I also think it's very legitimate and important for all of us, and you included, but it's relevant for all of us, to when we're thinking about that decision to go back to a physical workplace, if we've had the opportunity to be working at home, to ask about those sort of issues about ventilation that have been raised before by others, the ability to be in a workplace, if you're in a sort of teaching environment, whether that's a university or a school, you know, to make sure that class sizes are appropriate, that there is good ways of moving around work campuses and so on, and of course the transport to and fro. And as we would all say, mask wearing remains important. There are many transport systems that ensure that are still requiring that to happen. We've got to remember, though, that masks predominantly protect others rather than yourself. And therefore, for you as an individual, it's also important that we maintain that message about public health measures to limit infection. And it is a worry for all of us that at the moment we're releasing some of that, although it's reassuring as well that Christina has identified in her presentation that there still is some concern. I think without wanting to be scaremongering, we do want to maintain that caution. And this is why I personally am quite reluctant. The terminology of going back to normal is we need to provide an environment where we're all safe.
Can I bring in Zubaida next, and then anyone else wants to finish, and we'll take one more question after that. Zubaida.
I think that's a really excellent question, Marion, and you know, good for you for sort of looking out for others, which I think is something that you know, we started off with in this pandemic, but you know, slowly that narrative has shifted, mostly with government more than the public. The reason, one of the many reasons that your question is very important is, you know, you live in a multi-generational household, and it's something that we know is a high risk factor. We've known that all along in this pandemic, it's a high risk factor, and especially that combination of multi-generational and overcrowded. And, you know, I'm not suggesting your house is overcrowded, but we know that overcrowded homes as well has an additional risk factor. And it's something that this government has ignored in completely letting this virus go, letting it rip. They've ignored that it will have an uneven impact on different households. And that's also the issue with personal responsibility, because as you've rightly mentioned, you've got that personal responsibility, but you can't do anything about ventilation in the workplace other than raise it. You can't do anything about ventilation in public places unless they do something about that. And of course, government needs to act in that place. Government needs to make sure that public places see their responsibility around that. So once again, it raises that issue. And I think, as everybody has mentioned, and Steve in particular has raised the point, we can't let go of all the public health measures right now. It's absolutely wrong when there are people with different vulnerabilities in our society. And that includes, of course, your parents, who, even though they've been double vaxxed, it doesn't mean that they are completely protected. We know there are breakthrough cases, and it doesn't mean that even when there are breakthrough cases, that everyone can recover as quickly. Well, and Professor Anthony Costello, of course, has talked about how he suffered for 3 weeks, but for some people, it may be much worse. So that's all the more reasons to have the public health measures on top of personal responsibility, which you have.
Thank you so much. Marion, I hope that is of some use. It's a tricky situation. And I was really aware of when the NHS did a campaign, which was every Zoom call from home helps. There was a whole emphasis on doing things because it was helping society, and it was when they'd got their messaging spot on, and it's really significant that we've lost that consistency. Claire Hasty, you've been patient, thank you so much. And you have an important question I think we're going to have to finish on. Sorry we couldn't get any more questions in. Claire.
Hi, I'd like to know, why do scientists and policymakers use terms like herd immunity, population immunity, and indeed the word immunity at all, when we know that people can and are being reinfected, having had natural infection before and or double vaccinated? And we see that among the 42,000 members of our long-COVID support group. And it feels, we know from emerging data that around 20% of breakthrough infections, people still have symptoms at 6 weeks or more. And we know already that mild and asymptomatic cases can lead to debilitating long COVID. So is it a falsely reassuring term, and is it indeed even accurate to use the term immunity?
Thank you, Claire, and sorry, and all the best to you and everyone who's a member of your long COVID group. Steve.
Yeah, absolutely right, Claire. So the problem is that what we're talking about here is a population effect. So population immunity requires that enough of us are what you might term a hostile environment to that virus, such that if one person is infected, it's very unlikely to spread to more than one person. That's where this R value comes from. If that isn't happening, it's below 1. If it's happening to more than one person, it's above 1. Now, everyone that's vaccinated has protection from their severe disease, but everyone also primarily, apart from the unfortunate case we heard about just before, has those antibodies which will also protect against transmission. And so what we need to do is create that environment where that virus cannot spread and get the cases down, because you're absolutely right. In a small proportion of cases, we do see breakthrough infections, and that can still result in disease. And especially with new variants coming through, Delta, now we need 2 jabs, not 1. We've had to change our vaccination policies. If we take another step down that road, then we could have even more problems. So again, I think it just comes down to the idea that if we want to see this vaccination program through to its logical conclusion and protect everybody, including those that cannot respond to or have the vaccine, then we need to achieve higher coverage and we need to control infection rates. And we're not doing that. So I have every sympathy for people that are succumbing to this virus now, because they've been given a slight false sense of security by having their vaccines and then had to be told, oh, well, actually, you have to wait a minute. So I personally feel that we can't hang everything on the vaccines. We need to support those vaccines, because if we lose their fantastic abilities to protect us through evolving a new variant, for example, that really will be bad for everybody as well. And you would hope they would take notice of everyone anyway. But yeah, I think you're right. But the problem is that it's something that we need to aspire towards, and we're certainly not there yet, I'm afraid.
I think it's a language thing. Using it as the term protection would be helpful rather than immunity, perhaps. And also using the word protection instead of restrictions, I think, would also help the debate.
Thank you so much. And I think to finish on one other point of language this week, I just wanted to ask any members of Independent Sage if they could comment about the Health Secretary's use of the word cower. He did obviously subsequently apologise when he talked about not cowering from the vaccine, but I think it it was quite a moment. Any thoughts on that? Dinan?
Well, I should say, first of all, he did apologise, and that is an incredibly rare thing to see this government doing, any government ministers in the pandemic. So I congratulate him for doing that. But basically, I think it displays a fundamental lack of understanding of the nature of health, the nature of interaction of health with people suffering, the interaction with society. And this is from our health secretary. So I think it displays, if anything, it displays his own view of his new role as health secretary.
Thank you so much, Dinan. Unless anyone else has any comments to add, I just wanted to, oh yeah, Steve, go for it. Go for it, Steve.
Sorry, I just wanted to add to what Dinan's saying. I think that part of the problem with this idea of advising people and suggesting people use common sense and not to be afraid and to try and get back to normal, all of that is doing is kind of putting the blame on people for getting infected on people themselves. And it's nobody's fault if you get yourself infected with this virus. It's present in our population. So I really do think that the choice of language was terrible, but yes, credit to him for apologising.
Thank you all so much, as ever, for a brilliant presentation from Christina, all the thoughtful answers, questions about some really important issues. Thank you to everyone, and all the best for those of you who are struggling with health or anxieties about having to shield. And as ever, it's a complete privilege to be in your company. So thank you. Until the next time.